This is Fans on the Run, a podcast made by, for, and about Beatles fans. And now, here's your host, Ethan Alexanian.
All right, everyone, welcome back to the show. I'm Ethan Alexanian, yada, yada, yada. You don't want to hear from me. Today, we have a great guest, even though it's our second episode. I know I have some reach. We have author, professor, dean, music historian, cat lover, and most importantly, Beatle fan, Kenneth Womack. Ken, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you so much, and thank you for the shout out to my cats. Although they are very happy right now with sheltering in place, they've never been happier, quite frankly, than having their humans around.
My dog's quite happy, too. I always see you posting every day on Facebook your cat photoshopped into some sort of historical situation. It always gives me
that would
smile.
That would be my famous cat, Gertie McDowell, and she is well known the world over. She's kind of mean and feisty, but she is quite a character.
Well, you know, that's what you want in a cat, though. Am I wrong?
You are correct.
All right. So you have a new book coming out, Ken.
So my new book is entitled John Lennon 1980, The Last Days in the Life. And it fills what I believe is a very significant gap in our scholarship and really the story of John Lennon, and that is aggregating and bringing together all of the stories, but in such a way where the music is central to the tale. Mm-hmm. And I do that because one of the things that John used to say, in fact, he was saying it in one way or another on the last weekend of his life, that the most important thing about the Beatles' legacy and his legacy was the music. And that will be the part that shines through forever. While it may have been important for first-generation fans to think about the fashion and the clothing and the haircuts and all of those sorts of things, in addition to the music, those things hardly matter to a person like myself, right? I'm not a first-generation fan or many or all of the fans in the future. It will be the music that really draws people in. And so I wanted a story that talked about John sort of pulling himself off of the deck and coming up with several classic songs really in the last month of his life and building himself back into something that he felt comfortable showing the world. And that's the exciting story to me. So I'm hoping that my publisher will use a kind of tagline that this is not about how he died, because it is not, but how he lived.
And that's the beauty of it. Like John Lennon, when I think of John Lennon in 1980, I try and not to just think of the assassination. I'm trying to think of Double Fantasy and all the stuff that was recorded then and his return.
Sure. And it's one of the interesting things that you discover when you look closely at the story is that, his return was being plotted much, much earlier than those last months. He often, in his last interviews, would trace his comeback to going to Bermuda. And he certainly 79? Does. That would have been the summer of 1980, and he does some amazing work that summer. There's no doubt about it. In Bermuda when he travels there. But many of these songs, like Watching the Wheels in particular, had been around for a while. He'd been thinking about it for a long time and working on bringing it to fruition. So one of the interesting things about doing the project is going back and accounting for that. So I had to do a lot of work to sort of dig into the past to show when he started working on a song like Nobody Told Me, which was roughly around 1976, and parts of it were probably rolling around in his head since 1974.
Really?
And and what's fascinating about that is that was always how John Lennon wrote. in the sense that even back in his Beatle days, he would work on song fragments. And there's so many great examples, right? The pieces that went into I've Got a Feeling or A Day in the Life. Those were song fragments that he would bring together and find a sort of more fully realized whole, and he would create something out of those songs. So Double Fantasy was no different. For example, Just Like Starting Over is 3 or 4 different songs fused together. I love studying his process and how he would bring off these ideas.
I'm just processing that. Wow. I've never really realized that he had such a fragmented approach to songwriting. But I'm thinking back to Just Like Starting Over, and I can kind of hear those 3 separate songs.
Sure, there was one called The Worst Is Over. There was another one called I'm Crazy. And all of these, I think it was called I'm Crazy. But and in any event, he would merge these ideas together and create several different sounds. He and McCartney were doing this quite early. Remember, they would call their musical bridges, they would describe them as middle eights, as subsections of their songs that were differentiated from the chorus and the verses. And John, thinking as McCartney and he had done very early on when they were still teenagers, would think spatially about music. And in a sense, it does have him standing out in a certain kind of artistic way, say, from the others. Not to say that he's better necessarily, but different. A great example would be I Am the Walrus, right, which he wrote over several different writing sessions and where he sort of hauled all of these ideas together.
So, shall we proceed with the you part of the interview?
Oh, whatever you'd like to do.
Is there anything more you'd like to say about your book?
I'm very, there are a number of new details that I've been able to glean and authenticate for the story that I'm not quite ready to divulge just yet. One thing I'm
holding your cards close to your chest.
That's right. I'm not the greatest poker player, but some of these things need to be saved at the moment. But one thing that I'm intensely proud of, and I've tested this on several, I guess we call them beta readers now, right? And that is the issue of how to deal with his death itself. Because again, the book is not about, it's about him, and it's about him living. So I'm very proud of the way I conclude the book. And maintain the spotlight on him and his art. And the last word in the book, I'm happy to say, is Sean Lennon's. Just a beautiful piece that I found in one of his essays about how he thinks his father may have come up with Watching the Wheels, and how it had connected with him when he was very, very young, still 4 or 5 years old.
All I can say is I am very excited to read this book when it eventually comes out later this year.
That's right.
Do you have a release date yet?
Officially, it's going to be released in October, but I think we'll be seeing it earlier than that. I think we'll see it in September. Just very excited about it. There'll be a special edition that will come out too. That will have maps from the period, that will have different kinds of period photographs and maps, so that what I really wanted the book to do, and what I feel like it does pretty well, is it also takes you back to 1980 in New York City, the place where John Lennon lived, which, for anybody who knows New York now, well, especially right now where nobody's on the streets, but the New York City of the 21st century is very, very different than the one 40 years ago in which John Lennon lived. It was a place that had a much higher crime rate. Buildings were in disrepair. City ordinances had not arrived at the same kind of high quality standards that they strive for today. So it was a very gritty, different kind of place. And I really try to help the reader feel what it's like to be in that space way back then, when the world was different. And New York in particular was very different.
From what I've read, New York is, well, as you said, a very different place now, because the tourist trap, Times Square, used to just be just prostitutes and crime before it became kind of Disney-fied, if you will.
That is exactly right. And I happened to go visit the city not long after Lennon had been murdered, and that kind of gritty Times Square still existed back then, in its way. And I'm glad I saw it though, because of course now it's the area's
entirely.
That's right. It's heavily policed, but also, in addition to that, there's just the very natural fact that it has become such an expensive place that the financial, price of admission alone limits the people's ability to live there and spend time there. So a lot of the sort of seedier places simply were run out of town because of the high rents, right?
The unstoppable wave of gentrification.
There you go. That's right.
All right. I have a few I want this to be structured like a conversation, but I've given myself a few kind of ground posts so it can guide the conversation along, just so I don't completely run off the tracks.
Okay.
And I think I'll start with the first thing. When did you first discover the Beatles?
I discovered the Beatles in a really lame kind of way. Well, no, I'm proud of it. It's kind of a kitschy story. I kind of like stories like that.
So do I.
Yeah, I mean, it almost makes it more fun, although it's very uncool. I discovered them when I was, I believe, 11 years old, and I was... I think it was breakfast. Yeah, it was definitely breakfast. And my favorite show had been preempted. It was a terrible show called the New Zoo Review. And it was this strange show where you had these characters who were animals who lived with humans, not like our pets, but like fully fledged friends and neighbors. And I mean, they had names like Freddie the Frog and I think Henrietta Hippo.
I feel embarrassed now because I consider myself fairly knowledgeable about pop culture. I have never heard of the New Zoo Review.
Yeah, it's you can find it on YouTube, and it wasn't. I mean, the point that's interesting to me is at a certain level it wasn't any good. No offense, you New Zoo reviewers out there who still exist, but it just wasn't very good. It was kind of
them.
Yeah, but it was kind of a strange little show where, that Freddie would sing a song or Henrietta Hippo or the Humans or whatever. And the thing about it that was interesting that I think a lot of us are like this, I definitely am, I got used to it being on. And maybe it was a bit of OCD or something, but I got used to this show being on. So one day when it was gone, even though it wasn't very good, I mean, I was pretty pissed because it had become part of my routine. And I would watch this thing. I think it was on at 7 a.m. and, about 7:30 you had to leave to go to school.
Okay.
So it really pissed me off when the show wasn't on, and they preempted them. And of course, the show had been canceled. I didn't know this at the point. And it just, or my network, my local station down in Houston had quit bringing it forth. But, and they replaced it with the Beatles cartoons.
Oh.
And there they were. And, the cartoons themselves are fun, but, they're not great artworks. But what struck me almost immediately, I think actually immediately, was just that the songs were spectacular. I think the first one I saw, I don't know why, and it doesn't make sense in terms of the order of the cartoons, but I feel like it was Help. And if you recall, each episode would have two songs that would be, sort of showcased. and it was probably the episode. I think I'm just remembering that one episode because the song was so really connected with me. I think it was actually probably the "I Want to Hold Your Hand, I Saw Her Standing There" episode. But anyway, I was just immediately struck by how great the music is. And what's interesting to me in this kind of deep retrospect is that's how everybody discovers them now, right? I mean, it's such a second, third, fourth, whatever generation. It's how everybody will discover them. You will hear them in some form. Maybe it will be on YouTube. Maybe it'll be on some music distribution service. Maybe it'll be on television. Or in my case, it literally was on television. It almost doesn't matter what the format is. When people discover them, and thousands of people, maybe more, have discovered them just today. People are discovering them in the time we've been on this conversation.
That is statistically probably true.
Yeah, and when they do, we both know what happens. You're like, wow, this music is different and better than the other things I've heard. Mm-hmm. It just immediately stands out. And when I talk to my students today, who are now 30 years younger than I am, when they talk about their Beatles experiences, it's almost the same thing, even though it may be a different format.
Mm-hmm. It's universal. The music comes first.
Right, and when you hear it, it just, it
grabs you.
Yeah, it's different. I guess the formative word is that it's different. You hear it and you think, wow, I still like, I don't know, let's pick on Taylor Swift. I still like my Taylor Swift, but this is different. Mm-hmm. The same way that you might hear Mozart and say, wow, I like Mozart a lot better than Smithers from that period, whoever Smithers is. That, there's just, it's elevated and it's better.
I guess I'm uncultured because the first thing that came to mind was Mr. Burns' assistant.
Yeah, that's right. I should probably not use that example.
I was only born yesterday, so... So how did you go from seeing the Beatles on Saturday morning cartoons to where you are now with the Beatles?
Well, I had doting parents, like so many of us do, and actually it was not Saturday morning. It was every morning. It was on the way to school.
I use Saturday morning as a kind
yeah. Oh, I knew what you meant.
Yeah.
But I bring this up for a reason. So, after a few mornings of me listening and thinking about them, my father got in his carpool one day and went downtown into Houston. And when he came back that afternoon, he had a stack of Beatles books. Okay. Yeah, and it was the kind of thing that, parents do, right? Your kid get interested in something, you go and you kind of pick up what you can about that subject. This was 1977, so, at this point, the kind of material available about the Beatles was very different. There wasn't very much of it, for one thing.
The only Beatles books I can think of from that time are that illustrated record and Wally's book.
That's right. And so, in fact, I remember which books they were. So I do believe one of them was one of Wally Podrazic's books, like you said. Another one, I don't think the illustrated record, they didn't bring that home from the library. I did get that one shortly after this period. And then Nicholas Schaffner's book had just come out, although I didn't have it yet. And then there was also Wilfred Mellor's book that the library had, The Twilight of the Gods, which I was in no way prepared to read at that point in my life. It was way over my head. And it's really musicology, as you know. But it was just something to sort of stimulate my interest. And I think what it signaled to me, here I am listening to this music and thinking, wow, this is amazing. Where has this been? But at the same time, I'm seeing that there are books written about them. And of course, the Guinness Book of World Records were big at that time. And so, I would look up in the Guinness Book and the Beatles would be all over it for their greatness in terms of sales and those sorts of things. So it was, I think it was signaled to me pretty early on that this was something important in more ways than one.
I find it kind of interesting, as opposed to everyone else who I've talked to, where they've, gone out and gotten an album first. You go out and get the books. which it's kind of fitting in a way because it's like a supervillain origin story, and now you're this best-selling Beatles author.
It is kind of my approach, and maybe again it was being modeled by my dad at that point, but that's what I do. When I'm interested in something, I go get the literature on it so I can learn more about it. And
I do the same thing.
Yeah, and I mean, and sometimes I'll even read several different books about the subject to try to get different perspectives, right? And, if you want to do that with the Beatles, it's ridiculous how many different perspectives you can get.
Yeah, because on one hand you have, like, the Mark Lewisons of the world, and then you have the Albert Goldmans.
Yeah, and now, that's a great pair you just brought up. Mark mentioned them, I think, just last week. Mark is not a critic of Albert Goldman. He is, he gives the late Albert Goldman a lot of credit for the kind of assiduousness of his research. In fact, all of I believe his papers are available in the city, where he has his notes and et cetera to underscore the quality of research. My issue with Goldman has always been, only been, two things. One, I'm just not interested in that story at a certain level.
Yeah.
The sordid private lives of other people. At a certain point, nobody stands up to scrutiny, right? Everybody has things they're embarrassed about or regret. The kind of tell-all sort of sordid parts of that book, I have issues with, just because, at a certain level, that's not what I'm interested in. But then what my biggest issue with Goldman, and I think Mark agrees with this, we talked about him a few years ago, but my biggest issue with Goldman is his music criticism. He really simplifies John, and I don't know if you recall, he talks about him being the writer of songs that are always based on three blind mice or something like that. And I remember thinking, well, you're missing, really, you can, just because a couple of his songs have these descending cadences, like All You Need Is Love, that's the whole of him. Where do you put Across the Universe or Watching the Wheels? These are amazing songs that stand on their own. Or Number 9 Dream, right?
Yeah.
One of his late interesting compositions that had very interesting changeable structures, and several of his songs have multiple key signatures. So my issue with Goldman was that, and the story, again, like I said, most of us won't hold up to that kind of scrutiny. John Lennon's no different. But when you look at the aesthetics of his creation, that's what's amazing about him.
Mm-hmm. And what really bothers me about the Albert Goldman book is he did all this fantastic research, as Mark Lewison said, but he didn't use a lot of it.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. And, again, you'd wonder why because it's a dense book. I mean, I'm looking at it right now. It's on my table here. It's a dense book.
It's such a thick book. If you hit someone over the head with it, I think you'd be able to give them a concussion.
Oh, absolutely. There would be trouble. But I guess my point is it's such a dense book with all of this research, and yet, like you said, he doesn't draw anything from it. So
it's a dense book, and it's a dense book.
Yeah, right. And you almost wonder if he had such disdain for John's work, why devote that kind of energy? I mean, I guess money, but why devote that kind of energy to somebody's story that you don't think perhaps is up to snuff?
Mm-hmm. And there was this interview I saw with him in Liverpool, I think, and someone asked him, do you just not like pop music? And he said straight up, no. He thinks it's too simple. And that just kind of explains it right there. His terrible takes on John's music.
Yeah, and that's unfortunate, right? Because if you feel that way, going in, then, why are you going in? Like I said earlier, the excitement of that story to me is watching him draft a song like Watching the Wheels or Beautiful Boy just dozens and dozens of times until he finally brings the right elements together and he's ready to go. And it's like great painting, right? You're watching this painting being made, and that's exciting. But when Goldman perhaps could have been watching those demos create and amalgamate into this splendid whole, instead he was more interested, in heroin and infidelity and all of those sorts of things.
I'm going to move us a little bit back towards you. So,
okay.
Apart from the books, what was your first Beatles album or single or what have you?
Yeah, so, of course, when this is 10 full years before the Beatles come out on CD. And so all of the American releases were still in vogue. If you went to a record store, those would be the albums you would see. Not long after, or roughly at the same time, my father bought all of those. That brought me home all those books. He also went and got a German release, The Beatles' Greatest, which is a book that has an album rather that has. I think the cover is from the Rubber Soul sessions, and
I think I have that one. It's the back cover of Beatles for Sale, I think.
Yeah, it may be, but what's interesting about it is it was a German release, and it was a kind of a greatest hits album from the first 2 or 3 years.
Yeah.
And so I listened to that pretty profusely. I think the next album he got for me was the Beatles' 1967-70. And I'll have to ask him if it was conscious. It probably wasn't, but I had the record for the Beatles' Greatest, and I had the cassette tape for the Beatles' 67-70. And of course, what strikes you is, even when I was that young, was wow, these are very different bands, even though it's the same band. I mean, the band that makes, Please Please Me and Strawberry Fields those seem like completely different bands, and I guess in many ways they are.
Hell, but it doesn't even seem like it's the same band that made Strawberry Fields and Let It Be. Those seem like different bands.
No, that's a very good point. So, I remember being struck by that. And in fact, after wearing out the Beatles' Greatest, which again is just these songs from 63, 64, 65, and then suddenly having the Beatles' 67-70 with all of these songs like I Am the Walrus, etc., it was a bit of a culture shock for me. I remember sort of having to consume it in bits.
A little overwhelming.
Yeah, it was, and it took me a while. I remember sort of slowly discovering those songs over a period of months, and then I remember for I guess it would have been my 12th birthday, so the next year in 1978, I started to buy the American releases, and I wasn't doing them in any kind of order. I think I bought a lot of them at Target, believe it or not. And I remember, I think it was for my birthday. No, it wasn't my birthday. It was sometime later in the year. My aunt brought over the White Album, which she had bought for me because I wanted it. I still don't think she likes the Beatles much today. She's still with us, but I'll check with her, but I'm almost certain. And anyway, I got the White Album, and I went up and played it. Of course, by this point, I'm familiar with Back in the USSR, right? Because it was on the Beatles' 67-70. But I remember Happiness is a Warm... No, it was Glass Onion coming on. And I thought, wow, this is different. I mean, it sounded like the early Beatles in a certain sense, right? It's kind of a straightforward song for a while. But then they talked about a dovetail joint. And I remember thinking, oh my God, it's about drugs and I'm going to get in trouble. And I was, my aunt...
a reoccurring theme.
Yeah, I'm going to get in big trouble here. And my mom's downstairs with Aunt Molly. This is going to go really bad. Going to go really badly for me. Of course, years later, I've learned from my father that a dovetail joint, and in fact, it's a carpentry term, right? It's about making good engineering. If only I'd known that one afternoon, I wouldn't have been so stressed out.
So you were just paranoid in your room listening to the White Album, thinking
That's
that you
right.
were going to get in trouble.
Right, because of their drug use was going to come back and hit me. But instead, I was missing John Lennon's metaphor, as one would do when you're 12 years old.
Mm-hmm. And you said you had heard back in the USSR before you had heard the White Album. Did
Right,
that
because
really
it was
prepare you to hear songs like Wild Honey Pie?
Oh no, and of course, this was an LP, and with a record, until you start moving the needle around, you're really a prisoner. The Beatles and George Martin had sequenced. So yeah, there was no getting around Wild Honey Pie, or any of the other songs.
Yeah.
And even as an adult, right? It's a strange album to behold because you have all these different styles stacked one upon the other. There's no rhyme nor reason. You'll go from a country song, a countrified song like Rocky Raccoon, and then suddenly it's Don't Pass Me By, and then you've got, Why Don't We Do It on the Road? I Will. All this crazy stuff sort of mashed together, very intentionally sort of swatting us around from different kinds of sounds.
Yeah, it's even to this day, when I have friends who are discovering the Beatles for the first time and they inevitably listen to the White Album, I always hear from them afterwards saying, that didn't feel like an album, that felt like 4 albums.
Oh yeah, and that's exactly what it is.
Yeah. In contrast to now, what did the Beatles mean to you then?
Yeah, and it's interesting. They have meant different things at different times. I was definitely in love with the music back in those days, and it was exciting for me to hear them for the first time, to go back and figure out which ones I loved. I think the next album I got was Love Songs. Remember that bootleg? Not bootleg, but one of those compilations that Capitol put together.
Fake leather brown cover.
I vividly remember discovering the song I'll Be Back. Yeah, really this kind of cheesy looking album. And, it was in those days, I would be discovering the songs, and they would hit me on a different kind of level, right? I'm about to be an adolescent at that point. Of course, within a few years, I'm discovering some of the solo work. I think I discovered Coming Up about the same time John Lennon did in April 1980. When John discovered it, he discovered it the same way I did, in a car. He was riding with Fred Seaman around Long Island, and they heard Coming Up, and John was like blown away that he heard Paul on the radio. I remember hearing it and knowing it was Wings, even though I'd only had a few of their records by this point, hearing the live version. My father and I were going to the dentist, which, I hated going to the dentist. That's not original by any means. And I remember we were coming back and we heard it and we both kind of enjoyed it together, and there was an interesting connection. And then, of course, Lennon is killed by the end of the year, and that changes the whole story.
That would have been a culture shock in and of itself. Having John Lennon, he just came back after a 5-year hiatus.
Right.
Just had this fantastic album, and then all of a sudden he's gone.
Yeah, I went out and purchased it when it came out in, I think, late November 1980, and I had it on display on my dresser, so I would see it, and I was just stunned, right? I'd only known this band for nearly 3 years and had only just begun learning about them, and suddenly this thing happens. It was obviously awful for his family, but for those of us out there, it felt. I remember vividly feeling, like I'd been personally robbed of something, right? Because
even though we're not related to them, they are, in a sense, family to us, because many of us have grown up with them.
Yeah, and we let them into our hearts with their music. So that was pretty stultifying. And that's probably why, frankly, at some level, I needed to go back and write this book to reclaim, I don't know, that period or that place.
If I may ask specifically, how did you find out that John Lennon had died? Like, where were you?
Yeah, so...
because everyone has a story of that.
Yeah, sure. And mine would have been very contemporaneous. I'd gone to bed early, so I would have been 14, about to be 15, and in a month, 2 months, I guess. But so I was 14, and when you're a kid and you're that age, when your parents are coming, right? Mm-hmm. And I was laying in bed, and I could hear my dad walking down the hall. And, I'm 14. I went to bed early. I was kind of tired, and I was thinking, I don't want to be bothered with whatever this guy's got going on, right? And so he kind of looked in my room, and I just pretended to be fast asleep. And, he went back downstairs. And the reason why I bring this up is because he must have just heard it on television, right? During the Monday Night Football. Yeah. Exactly. And so the next morning when I woke up, he had already left for work, and I was having my cereal, or, I'm sure it was cereal, there on he had set out the morning paper, which I believe the Houston Post was the morning paper and the Houston Chronicle was in the afternoon. And there was that, picture right there of John and the announcement that he'd been murdered.
Luckily, I haven't had to live through a death of a Beatle. I just barely missed George's death by a couple months. But it'll be a terribly sad day when we lose Paul or Ringo.
Sure, and this was... just god-awful. There's really no other word for it. It's just just a terrible thing. And
he was taken in such a senseless act of violence.
Oh, certainly. And, I usually phrase it, and I may have earlier during this call, I mean, he was wrenched out of the world. One minute you're there, the next minute you're not. It makes no sense. And it still doesn't.
No. It doesn't make sense, or it didn't make sense then, doesn't make sense now, and I don't think it'll ever make sense.
No, certainly not. No. Well, as George Harrison said, right afterwards, to rob life is the ultimate robbery.
Mm-hmm. As opposed to then, what do the Beatles mean to you now?
So today, I think the issue I have that we all do is a kind of over-familiarity, right? So now it's trying to find new things inside of the music that I haven't heard before or haven't heard in a certain kind of way. So that's sort of the place I'm in now, is trying to hear them differently. It helps that I regularly teach the Beatles. And so for that reason, I get to hear them through other people's, lenses, or see them through other people's lenses. My students, the privilege of having this conversation with you, and those sorts of things are really those things are really, it's really helpful to me, right? Because you want to discover new things and hear things in different kinds of isolation and distinction, and so that's the challenge for me now, is trying to find those places. But at a certain level, hearing John Lennon sing that perfect version from, I guess, February 1968 of Across the Universe still moves me, maybe in a deeper way, right? And thinking about him, since I've been studying him so much recently, and now being older than he was when he died, it really strikes me how 40 is so very young, and it's younger now than it was in his day, right? he was robbed of the opportunity to go back and rethink how he felt about things and people. And, even listening, as I have many, many times, to his interviews on that last weekend with Andy Peebles and others, and then Jonathan Cott, and then with Dave Sholin.
Didn't he do a Playboy interview like the day he died?
No, he was interviewed the day he died by a guy named Dave Sholin, who's a wonderful voice and radio from RKO Radio, lives out still in the Bay Area, is a wonderful person, and was very kind enough to talk to me for this book. He had done the Playboy interview. They started doing that even when Double Fantasy was still being produced in August and September. It had only just come out, though, because it was being held for this big special issue of the magazine around the time of the release of Double Fantasy. So it had been around for a couple of months. There was a big interview in Newsweek that was done slightly contemporaneous to that one. The last weekend was Andy Peebles from the BBC. Well, that was on Saturday into Sunday. And then on Thursday and Friday, he had seen Jonathan Cott from Rolling Stone. Sunday, he mercifully took the day off. And then Monday, he was interviewed. He had a photo session with Annie Leibovitz, and then was interviewed by Dave Sholin and his team. And just the gems throughout that weekend.
Let's bring this back to a slightly lighter note.
Yeah, I can go dark pretty fast.
Oh, don't worry. I can match you on that. What is your favorite memory of being a Beatles fan?
My favorite fan stories are shared ones that involve shared experience. So I do a record club here at Monmouth University. In fact, we just had one last night on U2's The Joshua Tree. And we do these record clubs. It's called Tuesday Night Record Club once a month. And we're doing a few extra right now because of the confinement. But and they're virtual, of course. But what's amazing about that, and what I like about that kind of fan experience, is the notion of sharing something. So, for example, when Sgt. Pepper turned 50 a few years ago, we of course did Sgt. Pepper as part of the series. And what was wonderful is just sitting in a room with 200 people, 200 other people, and listening to A Day in the Life, and just sharing the song in silence. There's something very powerful about that kind of communal experience. So those are my favorite experiences about experiencing the Beatles or music in general, is just being able to share those kinds of things with people. And I single that out because that's different than, say, going to a concert where you're being jostled and somebody's spilling their beer on you. And
I did have somebody spill a beer on me at a Paul McCartney concert at Fenway Park.
Exactly. So you know what I'm talking about. I mean, there's the awkwardness of going to concerts can sometimes. Oh yeah, you still love it, and you're glad you went, but it's different than sitting in a room with a great sound system and just sort of in general and in a communal fashion sharing the music. There's something very special. You mentioned Mark Lewis, and when White Album turned 50, we had a conference here at Monmouth 2 years ago, and Mark was our keynote speaker, and he came in early as a favor to me, and we did the record club together. And we had 400 people, and we would play different songs. And to have the experience of Mark being there and all of these folks listening to the music together, that's just amazing. Of course, he critiqued me, as he loves to do, in the nicest, kindest way. I love Mark's demeanor, but he would be like, "Well, why are you playing MP3s? You should have a Victrola, set up, or a phonograph set up here and play the original vinyl." And of course, all I'm thinking about is, well, wait a second, the record would skip, I'd bump it, what if something goes wrong? I can control an MP3.
Yeah.
But he loved it too. He loved the communal experience.
If I may touch on the communal experience, I think that's what made my first trip to the Beatle Fest last year so impactful to me, because I've never had a communal experience involving the Beatles before. And just hit me in such a deep place, being surrounded by all these people such as yourself and all these just people celebrating this music. Yeah. I'm just kind of taken aback, right?
Yeah, I like that. I like that point too. You know, that's what makes, even at its cheesiest, you know, that's what makes going to Beatles Fest worth it, right? Because you know, you're still having this shared experience, and you know, in life, we don't have that often anymore. I mean, and look back to the Beatles' own day. I know we weren't there, but, you know, in those days, remember, there were 3 channels, 3 networks, some in some cities, only 2.
Fewer where I'm from. I think there was only 1.
Right. So in those days, you know, things were just very, very different. And I bring this up because it just reminds us how probably more than ever, right, we need those kind of experiences, because things are not as communal as they used to be. In fact, right now, and hopefully by the time you air this, it'll be over, but probably not, huh?
No,
right
this
now,
is probably uploaded today or tomorrow.
Yeah, right now we're actually having as close to a shared experience as we can, right, in the world, where the world has kind of stopped or slowed in some places because of this international crisis. And there will be a kind of touchstone point where we can all reflect back on, you know, April 2020 when we all stayed home for a while.
Yeah. It's weird to think that we are living through a monumental historical event.
Yeah, isn't it? Yeah. It is kind of. It is kind of.
This will have books written about it. This will be in the history books.
Oh, for sure.
And it's just kind of happening to us.
Yeah, and you know, it exists outside of our control.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so here's something I always like asking people who are knowledgeable about the Beatles, and frankly, I don't think I could ask anyone better than you, except for maybe Mark Lewison, in terms of knowledge of the Beatles. What is your favorite weird piece of Beatles trivia?
It's not weird, but it's again, I tend to say to stay with the art. And that's what interests me, I guess. But where I'm going is I'm always astounded. In fact, we have so much. I told Mark this one evening a few years ago, you know, that, you know, I think I embarrassed him a little. I said, you know, I've had this whole great life because of you. I remember when it happened. I was in a bookstore, and there was his Beatles recording sessions, and I thought, my God, I don't know what this is, but I need this, right? And of course, it was amazing, and it still is a kind of Bible for me. It's the place I go to, and what I learned, and what I learned when I opened it up, right, is, you know, you'll have a day in 1965, and you know, I'll get some of this wrong, but your listeners will understand.
Oh yeah.
But there'll be a day where the Beatles will record, you know, I've Just Seen a Face, and Yesterday, and I'm Down, and it might even be the same day, you know, and they'll do all these amazing songs, and they're doing them so quickly and so well, and in some cases, they never return to them, right? Mm-hmm. You know, I mentioned,
reminded me of my favorite quote from the Ruddles, where they were talking about the first album. It's like, their first album took a day to record. The second one took even longer.
Yeah, that's exactly, and well done. But what to me, why I say that's my favorite piece of trivia about them is it just reminds us of so many things that are valuable. One, they worked really hard, and they worked all the time. Two, that they had such an embarrassment of riches always emerging from their work, that it was coming so quickly and so fast that they could barely get it down before they had to get to the next thing. And I think that's, in a lot of ways, that's their story.
Mm-hmm. just rushing against the clock to get the new LP out.
Yeah.
If I may share my favorite piece of Beatles trivia, I know you aren't a big fan of the personal, or that's not your specific favorite aspect.
I'm okay. No, I'm interested in it. Don't get me wrong. I mean, I think that the personal aspects are defining, when it comes to telling their story. So, no, I have no problem with it. I just don't like to do it to the point where it starts to
take away from the music.
Dull this. That's right. Yeah, exactly.
But my favorite piece, I read somewhere that in '68, John called it an emergency meeting at Apple, dragged all the Beatles there, and then informed them that he was in fact the second coming of Jesus Christ.
Right.
He was very high when he did this, and the meeting was shortly thereafter adjourned.
I love that. I do like that piece of trivia, and I like it for more reasons than just the sort of period moment where he thinks he's Jesus. I also like it because it reminds us that he may very well have been, and this would make sense with his psychology, and of course we understand this so much better now than folks would have back in those days. He was very likely manic depressive, right?
Of course.
That's a very common conclusion of folks who have that affliction. Bipolar, right? That sort of thing. And, they simply didn't have the vocabulary to talk about it.
Yeah.
I do like that one too. I'm glad you shared that.
It's my favorite thing to whip out whenever I'm, trying to talk to someone about the Beatles, and they ask me, what's the weirdest thing about the Beatles you know?
Right. And of course the others literally did not know how to deal with that.
No. Yeah. And I'm going to fire some quick questions at you, because we're almost, I think we're almost at an hour here, and I don't want to keep you too long. What is your favorite Beatles song?
Wow. I think the most important one's A Day in the Life, but
that doesn't matter about importance. What's your favorite?
Right. Yeah. My favorite's Happiness is a Warm Gun.
Really?
Yeah, I think that they're just on fire with that song, and it speaks to so much that was great about them.
Mm-hmm. Now, on the other side of that coin, what is your least favorite Beatles song?
It's Mr. Moonlight.
You're the second. I've had 2 guests on this podcast so far, and both of them have said Mr. Moonlight.
Oh, who was the other guest? I have to know.
My Uncle Paul.
Okay, yeah. Well, Paul's right, and in fact, Kid O'Toole and I, Kid O'Toole and I once did a show on this very issue at Beatles Fest, a session, and of course, as I grew up and I learned more about the Beatles, the song they could have included instead was "Leave My Kitten Alone."
I know,
which is eminently better.
But there's a certain charm to Mr. Moonlight that I kind of like. Those kind of droning harmonies. I kind of like the cheesy organ solo.
Oh yeah.
I know your respect for me is just dwindled.
Yeah, but you know what? I can respect people liking the song, right? Yeah. I mean, it's John sings it with incredible gusto. Yeah. It is in many ways kind of who they were, right? They liked doing something kitschy like that and throwing themselves into it. You know what I think one of the coolest things about the Beatles is? You mentioned, the Jesus Christ story. I love the fact that when they had the biggest stage in the world, and they're doing the Sullivan Show, that they play Till There Was You. Right? They don't need, they had so little need to be cool at that point. They didn't care. They did a piece from the Music Man. I mean, I love that about them.
That actually may answer what my least favorite Beatles song is.
Oh, what's that?
Till There Was You. Controversial, but that's what I think.
Okay, well, there you go.
All right. So on another note, what's your favorite Beatles album?
It is, well, that changes a lot.
What are your top 3 favorite Beatles albums?
Probably Abbey Road, the White Album, and Sgt. Pepper. Not necessarily in any kind of order, because they were trying to do big, great things, and I love ambition, right? And I love when artists say, you know what, we're going to go do something different and better, and they throw caution to the wind, and that makes the Beatles great. And of course, the other thing that does, and I'm sure you've thought about this too, is they start with Love Me Do and they end with Abbey Road.
Exactly.
It's almost a straight upward trajectory where they just get better and better and better and even better still, and then they walk off the stage forever.
And speaking of
and
just walking
nobody
off
else
the
does
stage,
that quite the same way.
Speaking of just walking off the stage on that high, I don't think there's any better piece of recorded music to end a band's career than The End.
Right. No, I would agree. Yeah, as far as we were concerned, hearing those solos and, of course, the beautiful cadence with the piano and the couplet, and then, of course, the surprise second ending with Her Majesty is very powerful stuff.
The unintentional second ending.
Yeah, but it was beautiful because it punctures the idea of endings in the first place, right? All endings are just beginning something else.
And I think this is my last kind of structured question. What's your least favorite Beatles album?
Oh, wow. The least favorite one.
If you say the one that
it's not going to be a I don't know which one Paul said. But mine is actually going to be With the Beatles.
Oh.
I think it's the music is generally great on that record, but since I've been teaching the albums for so long, it just feels, particularly when you think of it outside of the I Want to Hold Your Hand single.
Yeah.
While there are many leap forwards on that record and many great performances, it doesn't have the flash and the spark of Please Please Me. And then, of course, A Hard Day's Night comes along, and it's this great piece of original work. So it's probably With the Beatles. I know that's probably not a popular choice, but it's the one for me.
That is an interesting choice.
What about you?
It's a very interesting choice. I'd have to say Let It Be. I really thoroughly dislike that album.
You know, I would have said that it wasn't a favorite of mine until I got to see it through the eyes of my my youngest son. I remember when he was discovering the Beatles, and he just took a liking and made a connection with that album, and I saw it through his eyes, and I began to reevaluate the whole business.
But that's the beautiful thing about it. Everyone interacts with the music in a different way, and that's exactly why I've started this podcast, is because I want to hear these stories from different people about how different aspects have touched them.
Yeah. So I've reconnected with that one in interesting ways.
Is there anything more you'd like to add?
Well, just it's been a great pleasure talking to you, and I'm glad to be part of the podcast. It's these are great questions, and what you just said to me is the common denominator of this band and why we're still in love with them and we like talking about them. It is because, you know, first of all, the quality is so incredibly high and so special, but then also that you can hear another person's perspective and connect with different parts of the story in different ways. And every time you do, it becomes this more full and more nuanced and rich kind of story, right? It just becomes more powerful. It never gets old.
Exactly. I think the Beatles can just be summed up by that. They just never get old.
No, and even when they get old, they don't get old.
No. I mean, Ringo's 80 or something.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, he will be this summer.
That's weird to think. The Beatles' music sounds relatively modern, but they're in their late 70s and early 80s almost.
That's right, and And part of that modern sound, that contemporary sound, we owe so much to George Martin for being able to make those records as clean and as perfect as possible, so that they do stand the test of time.
If I may just butt in here, if any of the listeners at home have not read your two-part George Martin biography of Maximum Volume and Sound Pictures, you're doing yourself a disservice. Go read them now.
Well, thank you for that, and do send my best wishes to Uncle Paul.
I will. So I think that about sums it up for this week. Next week we'll have Kid O'Toole on the show, and I don't know how to end these podcasts yet. This is only the second one.
Well, you're going to have the queen of all Beatles media, so...
I will have the queen of all Beatles media. Your Talk More Talk co-host.
That's right.
If I actually may be honest, I was a little nervous in asking you to get on the show. So I asked Kit first, how do I ask Kenneth?
Oh, God, what did she say?
Oh, no, she said, tell him he can plug his book.
Oh, you didn't have to tell me that. This has been a lot of fun, and Kit's wonderful, but yeah.
Yeah. All right, so, Kenneth, thank you for coming on the show.
Awesome. Well, dude, let me know when it's out and available.
I will let you know.
All right. Well, you have a good one, and stay safe out there.
You too.
All right.
Stay safe, stay home, sanitize your hands, and have a good night, good morning, good evening, whenever you're listening to this. I don't know. I'm not good at ending this. So
you'll find a way.
Ta-ta for now.
Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Fans on the Run is produced by Ethan Alexanian. Additional voiceovers by Richard Phillip. This has been a Showtown production.